The Celestial Honors Academy existed because someone had decided that excellence could be purchased, packaged, and delivered to the offspring of the galaxy's wealthiest families, regardless of whether those offspring possessed anything resembling competence. Station Harmony 12 floated in diplomatically neutral space, which was a polite way of saying it occupied territory nobody particularly wanted, but everyone agreed to pretend was valuable. The station itself was an architectural monument to the principle that if you charged enough money, people would ignore fundamental design flaws. 43 different atmospheric zones coexisted through a ventilation system that worked approximately 60% of the time. The gravity fluctuated between sectors because standardization was expensive and the board of directors had decided their quarterly bonuses were more important. Environmental controls maintained conditions suitable for carbon-based, silicon-based, and several theoretically impossible-based life forms, all of them equally uncomfortable. Tuition cost more than small planetary economies generated annually, which meant the student body consisted entirely of beings whose families had confused wealth accumulation with evolutionary fitness. The marketing materials promised cultivating tomorrow's visionaries in an environment of unparalleled excellence, which translated to warehousing rich kids while their parents conducted business elsewhere and pretending education was happening. The academy boasted a faculty of allegedly prestigious educators who discovered that taking exorbitant salaries to ignore problems was significantly easier than actual teaching. They maintained stellar placement rates by the simple expedient of ensuring that everyone graduated regardless of performance, then relying on family connections to secure prestigious positions for students who couldn't locate their homeworlds on a star chart. Among this collection of purchased credentials and manufactured prestige floated the Shirit, a species that evolution had optimized for beauty and flight while completely neglecting survival instincts. They stood approximately 3 feet tall, covered in plumage that shifted through the visible spectrum based on emotional state, with wings spanning 8 feet that contained bones with the structural integrity of crystallized sugar. Their homeworld had been paradise by any reasonable definition. Gentle atmospheric currents, abundant vegetation, and exactly 0 predators because nothing on the planet had evolved aggression as a survival strategy. Natural selection had turned them into living art pieces, gorgeous and completely unprepared for any environment that contained actual danger. The protagonist, let's call her Mika, because her proper name required vocal structures that most species lacked, had arrived at the academy with plumage cycling through vibrant purples and genuine optimism. 4 months later, her feathers remained locked in dull slate gray, and her optimism had been systematically shattered along with her skeletal structure. Every morning at 0630 hours, Mika navigated from her residential sector toward the academic complex through a corridor junction that had become her personal torture chamber. Alternative routes existed, but they added 30 minutes to her commute. And the Academy's scheduling algorithms had the flexibility of neutronium. Every morning, the Thros were waiting. The Thros had evolved on a world where harsh was considered a complement to environmental conditions. Gravity 3 times galactic standard, atmosphere composition that would kill most species in minutes, predators that hunted in coordinated packs with actual tactical planning, weather patterns that made planetary extinction events look like minor inconveniences. Natural selection had responded by creating living weapons. The Thros stood 9 feet tall, covered in interlocking armor plates that could deflect small arms fire, with musculature dense enough to generate forces measured in tons. Their regenerative capabilities meant losing limbs was annoying rather than catastrophic. Their capacity for empathy had been bred out approximately 12 million years ago when cooperation became less evolutionarily advantageous than simply crushing everything. The ringleader, Vrok, built like a military assault vehicle with anger management issues and the intellectual capacity of corroded hardware, came from a family controlling mineral extraction operations across 4 star systems. His academic transcripts suggested he'd never encountered a concept he couldn't fail to understand. But his family's annual donations exceeded the Academy's operating budget, so his graduation was predetermined. His companions filled traditional roles. Gar was larger and followed orders with the enthusiasm of someone whose family wealth was measured in millions rather than billions. Sect was smaller but crueler. The type who'd tortured small creatures as a juvenile and simply scaled up the hobby as he matured. The morning ritual had achieved the consistency of religious observance. Mika would turn the corner, carrying educational materials and diminishing hope. Vrak would block her path with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences. Gar would provide laugh track services while making observations about fragile species and evolutionary failures. And Sect would reach out with claws designed for rending armor plating and simply snap her left wing backward until molecular bonds failed. The medical facility staff were consummate professionals. They'd set fractures, apply regenerative compounds, and dispatch her to classes wearing stabilization equipment. Chirrut physiology healed rapidly when properly treated. By the following morning, her wing would be functional enough to break again. The faculty knew because surveillance systems monitored 94% of station surfaces. They knew because witnesses existed. They knew because medical logs displayed patterns that would make statistical analysis weep. But knowing and acting were separate activities entirely, and the faculty had perfected the former while studiously avoiding the latter. The Thros weren't technically violating regulations. Assault required proof of malicious intent. And Sect was exceptionally careful to frame each incident as accidental contact during corridor navigation. Micah never filed formal complaints because she'd learned the administrative process existed primarily to shield the institution from liability rather than protect students from harm. The official position, insofar as one existed in documentation nobody actually read, was that students needed to develop conflict resolution capabilities. The unofficial position was that intervention required effort and potentially upset families whose financial contributions funded administrative compensation packages. Character development, they called it. Preparing students for real galactic conditions, learning to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, which was sophisticated language for, we're being paid to pretend we don't notice weekly assault. Then Earth submitted a transfer application that made the admissions committee reconsider their career choices. Humanity had joined the galactic community 76 years prior, which was sufficient time for everyone to realize that welcoming them had been either the most brilliant diplomatic maneuver ever executed or the most catastrophic mistake in recorded history, depending on which recent incident you were discussing and who'd been affected. Humans originated from what official classifications designated a Class 5 extinction threat environment, which was bureaucratic language, meaning their planet was actively attempting to kill them through every available mechanism, and they'd somehow decided to thrive anyway. Through spite and increasingly creative violence. Earth featured predators with complex social hunting strategies. Diseases that mutated faster than medical interventions could be developed. Weather systems that treated cities like temporary obstacles requiring removal. Seismic activity that regularly destroyed civilizations. Gravity that made Thros uncomfortable. And humans had examined all these existential threats and decided to become the apex predator anyway through tool use and absolutely deranged risk assessment. They domesticated plants that were actively poisonous. They'd built civilizations while sharing territory with megafauna that could casually kill them. They'd achieved spaceflight while their homeworld was simultaneously experiencing multiple extinction-level scenarios. The galaxy had reviewed humanity's membership application and seriously debated rejection on grounds that any species insane enough to thrive on Earth probably shouldn't be trusted with interstellar capabilities. Then they'd reviewed Earth's technological development, and realized rejection wasn't actually viable. So they'd accepted humanity with extensive restrictions, comprehensive monitoring, and sincere hopes that Deathworld evolution wouldn't translate into galactic-scale catastrophes. 76 years later, the verdict remained undecided, but was trending toward, "This was definitely a mistake we're now stuck with." The transfer student's documentation arrived 4 weeks before she did. Her designation was Taryn Voss, and her previous institution was Earth's Arctic Sector Academy, which maintained a reputation for academic rigor and absolutely nothing else anyone wanted to discuss in official channels. The file contained transcripts demonstrating exceptional performance in astrophysics, comparative xenobiology, and something translated as applied conflict resolution that made the admissions committee nervous. It contained recommendation letters using phrases like remarkably focused and extremely capable, and perhaps better suited to alternative educational environments. It contained approximately 50% redacted incident documentation. The Academy's admissions board had reviewed this file, observed that Earth was paying 5 times standard tuition rates, and decided that whatever those redacted incidents contained probably wasn't their immediate concern. The admissions board had historically terrible predictive capabilities regarding future concerns. Taryn arrived on a Tuesday, which was what the station designated the second day of the standard week because someone had decided galactic civilization required pretending everyone measured time identically. She was average height for her species, which translated to tall by Academy standards, approximately 175 centimeters of bone density and muscle mass optimized for Earth's gravity. She maintained dark hair in a short, practical style, gray eyes that tracked movement with precision that made other species nervous, and posture suggesting she understood exactly how to weaponize her physiology and was simply choosing not to at this specific moment. The administrators processing her arrival noted she was courteous, efficient, and entirely unmemorable in the way that ambush predators are unmemorable until the moment they're not. She collected residential assignments, navigated to quarters without assistance, and attended orientation without questions. Then she began observing. Humans were persistence hunters, which meant their evolutionary advantages included tracking prey across continental distances through stubborn refusal to stop. This translated into pattern recognition capabilities that made other species uncomfortable and observational skills that bordered on active surveillance. Taryn attended classes and maintained silence unless directly questioned. She consumed meals alone in the cafeteria, selecting protein portions that made herbivorous species physically nauseous to observe. She utilized the fitness facility during off-peak hours, operating cardiovascular equipment until safety protocols terminated her sessions because the machines weren't designed for endurance predator physiology. And she watched Mika's wing get broken. Tuesday morning, Corridor Junction, 0630 hours. Taryn's route to first period intersected with the tragedy by pure navigational coincidence. She observed Vrock's blocking position, Gar's performance as designated laugh track, and Sect's casual brutality. She noted Mika's resigned acceptance, medical response timing, and complete absence of faculty intervention. She said nothing. Wednesday morning, identical scenario. Taryn arrived 4 minutes earlier and positioned herself where she could observe the complete interaction. She recorded biometric data, Thross reaction speeds, movement patterns, vulnerable joint angles. She noted security camera positions and emergency response protocols. She said nothing. Thursday morning, Taryn skipped morning nutrition intake to arrive 12 minutes early. She observed from a maintenance alcove, completely motionless in the way predators achieve stillness while stalking. She studied Sect's grip technique and the precise angle required to fracture chirrut wing bones. She calculated force vectors and tactical response options. She said nothing. Friday morning, Mika's plumage had stopped changing colors entirely, locked in exhausted gray. Sect was growing bored with routine and applied additional pressure. The crack resonated through the corridor like breaking crystal. Taryn's expression tightened fractionally. Still, she said nothing. By Monday of the second week, Taryn had observed sufficient data. She spent the weekend in the Academy's information repository, accessing public xenobiology databases, Thros physiological studies, regenerative capacity research, skeletal architecture analysis, nervous system distribution mapping, comprehensive medical documentation detailing exactly how their biology functioned, and, more critically, where it failed under specific conditions. She cross-referenced this with human martial combat archives, specifically those developed for asymmetric warfare scenarios, Krav Maga's emphasis on vulnerable point targeting, Muay Thai's focus on elbow and knee strike mechanics, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's joint manipulation principles, Russian Sistema's concepts of exploiting structural weaknesses. She reviewed footage of human combat sports, mixed martial arts fighters who'd mastered defeating larger opponents through technique and precision rather than strength, boxing matches where smaller competitors destroyed larger ones by attacking vulnerabilities, street fighting documentation from Earth's high-gravity urban environments, where humans practiced violence on each other for recreational purposes. By Tuesday morning, she possessed comprehensive understanding of Thros weaknesses and 23 different strategies for exploiting them. She selected the most efficient option. Tuesday, 30 hours. Mika rounded the corner precisely on schedule, her wing from yesterday's breaking already healed sufficiently to break again. Her plumage remained the gray of abandoned hope. Her educational materials trembled slightly in her grip. Vrock blocked the corridor with confidence derived from never facing challenges. Gar positioned himself at the left exit, already producing laughter at humor that hadn't occurred yet. Sect approached from behind, claws extending, anticipating the familiar sound of breaking bone. Taryn stepped out of the maintenance corridor that definitely wasn't part of standard student routes. "Gentlemen," she said, and her tone possessed the aggressive pleasantness of someone who'd already decided violence was inevitable and was simply observing social niceties first. "Fascinating ritual you've established. Very consistent. Predictable, even. Almost like you're following a schedule." Vrock rotated, his massive form occupying the space. Up close, he was genuinely impressive. 270 centimeters of evolutionary advantages and inherited wealth. His armor plates reflected corridor illumination. His dentition was visible when he smiled. "Human. This doesn't concern you. See, I fundamentally disagree with that assessment." Taryn advanced with hands loose and relaxed at her sides. "Observing someone commit assault every morning for 2 weeks makes it my concern. Basic ethical framework. You probably skipped that section in favor of remedial cognitive function exercises." Gar laughed because that was his designated function. "Walk away, Deathworlder. Your species might have a reputation, but you're still one individual against 3 Thros. Our armor can deflect projectile weapons." "Genuinely impressive," Taryn agreed. "Quick question about that armor. Does it cover your joints, specifically the articulation points where your plates connect? Because I've been conducting research, and your evolutionary development prioritized frontal protection over flexibility. Classic apex predator adaptation. Functions excellently until someone targets the gaps." Sect still maintained his grip on Mika's wing. "Your species has regulations about violence. We've researched human legal frameworks. You can't simply attack students." "You're absolutely correct," Taryn said. "Human legal systems have extensive restrictions on preemptive violence. However," she stopped advancing, still 10 feet distant. We have remarkably generous self-defense provisions, and defense of others, and proportional response doctrines that become quite flexible when addressing repeat offenders with documented patterns. She smiled, and several species' survival instincts began screaming warnings. So, here's your singular warning, which I'm providing because I'm not inherently violent. I'm practical. Release her, apologize, and develop better recreational activities. Or discover why Death World species don't have bullying problems. We have survivors and educational examples. The moment extended. Vrock's laugh was intended to be intimidating. Or what? You'll file a complaint? Alert the faculty who've been ignoring this for months? No, Taryn said. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of consequence through direct experiential learning. Final opportunity. Sect tightened his grip on Mika's wing. The small chirrut produced a sound intended to be brave, but emerged terrified. The crack began forming. Taryn moved. Humans aren't the fastest species in the galaxy. The Skriltics could cover 60 meters in under 2 seconds. The Venoth possessed reaction times measured in microseconds. But humans were persistence hunters with predator reflexes, and Taryn had spent every day of her existence at 1 Earth gravity, while the station operated at 0.6 standard. She covered 10 feet in under 2 seconds. Vrock was still processing movement when she reached Sect. Her first strike wasn't elaborate, just a simple palm heel thrust to his elbow joint, the articulation point where armor plates met and flexibility required structural gaps. Human skeletal structure was fundamentally over-engineered for station gravity. Her strike delivered approximately 800 pounds of force into a joint designed for strength rather than impact resistance. Something in Sect's elbow produced a sound like shattering ceramic. His grip released immediately. Mika stumbled away, wing intact, plumage flashing white with shock. Vrock lunged because that was his primary problem-solving methodology. Mass versus speed, strength versus precision. He outweighed her by 200 kilograms, but she was faster and possessed knowledge of where to strike. Taryn dropped low. Humans had remarkably flexible spines, another evolutionary advantage, and drove her elbow upward into his throat. Thros possessed thick armor everywhere, except the flexible tissue surrounding their respiratory passages. Evolutionary compromise between protection and biological function. Her elbow located soft tissue and introduced it to blunt force physics. Vrock produced a sound like a catastrophically failing atmospheric seal and staggered backward, both claws grasping at his neck. Gar was reaching for his communication device, which was tactically sound, but operationally too slow. His massive fingers were still fumbling with the device when Taryn pivoted and executed a roundhouse kick that would have been mediocre at Earth gravity, but was devastating at station standard. The communicator disintegrated. 4 of Gar's fingers probably fractured based on the sound and the way he retracted his hand, while producing a noise that roughly translated to, "Why does my entire existence hurt?" 4 seconds. 3 strikes. 3 Thros students radically reassessing their understanding of human capabilities. "Right," Taryn said, breathing only marginally harder. "So let's discuss how this functions now. You 3 are proceeding to medical. You're going to explain that you experienced a training accident, slipped on maintenance fluids, whatever fiction helps you achieve sleep, and you're never touching her again." Vrock was still attempting to remember how respiratory function worked. Sect cradled his destroyed elbow. Gar stared at his broken fingers like they'd personally betrayed him. "You attacked us," Sect managed. "Station regulations prohibit—" "Station regulations," Taryn interrupted, "prohibit violence between students. Observe, I haven't actually violated that regulation. This was defense of another. Justified force. Select your legal framework. But if you want to file complaints, the security footage documents 2 weeks of you 3 committing assault." So we can all proceed to discuss patterns of behavior with administration, or we can all maintain silence and move forward. Your selection. She rotated away from them, calculated risk, dominance display, and approached Mika. You intact? The small Shirit stared upward with eyes too large and currently too bright. Why would you? Because somebody should have done it weeks ago, Taran said. Come on, let's not be late to first period. They departed together. Behind them, 3 Thros students contemplated the variable nature of risk assessment and the sudden realization that size wasn't the only relevant factor. The medical facility incident report documented 3 cases of training accidents occurring simultaneously, which should have triggered investigation protocols but somehow didn't. The attending physician noted that Thros students engaged in recreational combat regularly and filed standard treatment documentation. The security footage was reviewed by a junior administrator who observed approximately 17 policy violations, flagged the file as requiring senior review, and forwarded it into a bureaucratic void where uncomfortable truths were sent to die slowly. By lunch period, the entire student population possessed the information. Data traveled at quantum speeds in enclosed environments, especially when that data involved violence and species dynamics and the sudden demonstration that humans weren't merely theoretical threats. The cafeteria's ambient noise decreased 20 decibels when Taran entered. She collected her food, something with sufficient protein to make herbivores physically ill, and sat at an empty table. 15 seconds later, Mika sat across from her. May I? The Chirit started, her plumage flickering uncertain green. Certainly, Taran said. They consumed nutrition in silence for approximately 6 minutes before Mika spoke again. Nobody has ever... Yeah, Taran said. I observed. Why? Taran considered this while consuming something approximating beef. Because I've been in your position. Different context, identical result. And I decided that if I ever witnessed it happening again, I'd be the person who acted instead of the person who observed and did nothing. You could be expelled. Possibly. Probably not. Earth pays quintuple tuition, and the footage documents justified force. Worst case scenario, they issue a warning, and I promise to behave. Taran's smile made several nearby students remember urgent appointments elsewhere. Best case scenario, those 3 learn that target selection has consequences. The week that followed demonstrated the fluid nature of social hierarchies when force dynamics shifted fundamentally. The Thros students huddled in defensive groups, recalculating their position in the pecking order. Other species observed Taran with mixtures of respect and terror. The smaller, more vulnerable students began orbiting her cafeteria table, not quite approaching but definitely gravitating closer. Mika started speaking in classes. Her plumage cycled through brighter colors. Her wings remained structurally sound. Vrock made one attempt at retaliation on Friday, cornering Taran in a supposedly empty corridor. She fractured his regenerating arm in 5 places, dislocated his shoulder and hip, and suggested he invest in pattern recognition as a survival skill. He didn't attempt again. The faculty continued their policy of aggressive non-intervention because acknowledging the situation would require effort and possibly accountability. The surveillance footage remained under review in the administrative equivalent of permanent storage. By month's end, the Academy had achieved a new equilibrium. The Thros students learned that might didn't guarantee right, especially when regeneration couldn't maintain pace with educational experiences. The smaller species learned that protection was possible when someone cared sufficiently to provide it. And Taran established herself as exactly the kind of student the Academy needed, but definitely didn't want. The administration processed 61 incident reports involving human intervention in student disputes. They filed all of them under cultural differences requiring further study. and pretended vigorously that they weren't operating an institution where violence had become the primary conflict resolution mechanism. 3 months into the semester, Mika asked Taran why she'd actually transferred from Earth. They were in the observation deck, watching stars rotate past, and Taran was quiet for an extended period. There was another student. Smaller individual, wrong species in the wrong district. Local enforcement wasn't intervening, so I intervened. What happened? The individual lived. The bullies learned lessons. And Earth's Arctic Sector Academy suggested I might thrive in a different educational environment. Taran's reflection in the viewport showed a smile that wasn't entirely pleasant. Turns out, some lessons are universal. Do you regret it? Not even slightly. Mika's plumage shifted to warm gold. Thank you. Don't mention it. Literally. I'm reasonably certain. Half of what I did violates regulations I haven't read yet. They observed the stars in comfortable silence. 2 students from incompatible species united by the simple truth that sometimes the right action was the violent action. And civilization only existed because someone was willing to enforce it when the systems failed. The semester continued. Examinations were passed or failed based on actual merit. The Thros students developed healthier hobbies, or at least more careful target selection. The Chirrut students navigated corridors with wings that remained intact. And Taran Voss established herself as the walking embodiment of the galaxy's ongoing debate about whether humanity's inclusion was brilliant or catastrophic. By year's end, the Academy had achieved something resembling functional civilization, maintained through a combination of actual regulations and the understanding that some students had evolved beyond their apparent vulnerabilities and were perfectly willing to demonstrate this fact through direct application. The administrators never officially acknowledged anything had occurred. The security footage remained permanently under review. And the galaxy's commitment to peaceful coexistence continued being maintained through strict regulations and occasional reminders that some species had evolved to solve problems with extreme prejudice. Mika's morning routine changed permanently. She still woke at 6:30, still consumed terrible nutrient paste, still navigated oversized corridors. But now she walked with intact wings beside a human who decided that natural selection could use some artificial intervention, and the universe was better for it. The Celestial Honors Academy continued its mission of educating tomorrow's leaders, producing graduates who'd learned that consequences were things that happened to people who picked the wrong targets, and that sometimes the most important lessons weren't in any curriculum. And somewhere in the corridors of Harmony 12, a small Chirrut student flew with unbroken wings while a human walked beside her. And both of them understood that civilization was just controlled violence pointed in the right direction. The galaxy called it barbaric, uncivilized, a concerning regression to primitive conflict resolution. But then, the galaxy hadn't spent 10,000 years learning that the alternative to violence wasn't peace. It was just violence happening to people who couldn't fight back. Humans called it justice. The rest of the galaxy would learn the difference eventually, or they wouldn't, and the educational experiences would continue until pattern recognition improved. Either way, Mika's wings stayed intact. Taran's record remained technically clean, and the bullies learned that breaking fragile things worked perfectly until something unbreakable broke them instead, which was exactly the kind of cosmic irony the universe specialized in, and exactly the kind of lesson that made humanity's membership in galactic civilization either the best decision ever or the worst mistake imaginable.